Hello and welcome to Builders, the podcast where we explore the journeys and insights of top professionals shaping the future of technology. I'm Lee Haynes, and today we have an exciting guest, Lele Cao, Senior Principal AI and Machine Learning Researcher and Research Lead at King, a part of Microsoft. With extensive experience in artificial intelligence and machine learning, Lele brings a wealth of knowledge on developer hiring challenges, desirable engineering traits, and the evolving landscape of AI. Let's get started. Lele, a warm welcome to the podcast. How's it going?
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here as a guest. Thanks for the introduction.
Thanks for joining us. I think we can, like I normally do. Let's start with your journey. Tell us a little bit about your career journey, how you got into AI and machine learning research, what drew you to the field.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. My interest into AI started really early, actually, back in the years of approximately 2003, 2004.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, I was looking to do my master thesis. I was talking to a professor from the mathematics department in my university, and I was asking, can I do something with you around neural networks? And you guess what the answer at that time that I got from him? He said, you can actually do research with me, but please don't do neural networks because that thing simply don't work.
At that time.
Yeah, at that time, 2003, imagine. But I stick it around, keep track of what is happening in this domain until the year 2010-ish. I started to realize things like AlexNet and also recognition of handwriting. Those demos really intrigued me and encouraged me to do a PhD in this domain. So I determined to quit my job at that time and started my PhD journey in Tsinghua University in China in combination with UniMelb, which is a Melbourne University in Australia. So I stayed 3 years in Beijing and 1 year in Australia, did my PhD in robotics and AI. And then afterwards, I naturally started my career in AI, started with, doing geographical information system, e-commerce at Alibaba, and then moved to King at that time. King at that time was not acquired by Microsoft, by the way, in the gaming industry. And then I moved to private equity investment. And now I'm here, actually back to King. Very interesting. That means King has a unique attractiveness to me. But slightly differently, nowadays, King was acquired by Microsoft. I think it was one of the biggest acquisition in history, probably in the gaming industry. Super exciting. And now I'm more in the applied research part in the gaming industry. Yeah.
Really, really exciting, extensive kind of background there.
Yeah.
But so you're kind of working at the intersection of research and real world applications, right?
That's right.
What excites you most about working at this intersection?
Yeah, I would say, doing pure research, or someone call it fundamental research, it's certainly very interesting, intriguing. But usually doing that is a bit siloed most of the time because you are too deep into a research question. Think about, PhD student or postdocs that they are like studying one particular problem super deep. No one else probably has the same depth of knowledge. So very much siloed in a sense. But if you are trying to do applied research in industry, it's, I would say, very different because you have a very much tangible problem to work with. And although you are doing research and in a time horizon of 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, long term, your research hopefully going to be used in some real scenarios and generating business values. And that is truly exciting, I would say. And not even mentioning you have probably a lot more colleagues around you and very much diversified bunch of people. That is super fun.
And a little bit onto like AI and its kind of future in game development specifically. It's obviously transforming like the gaming industry significantly. How is it shaping game development at Activision Blizzard King? Can you share examples for where AI is being used to enhance player experiences or streamline the game production, for example?
Well, that's an interesting question, and also I guess it has a big scope to some extent because there are a lot of efforts, I would say.
Mm.
Some of them are really early in its journey. Some of them actually already put into use. If you want me to give you an example, I think I would say, training some intelligent bot for testing, automatically testing the game or
Mm.
the game content would be a natural use case. And actually, that's something that I've been working with from, I think, more than 7 years ago to
Mm.
start with. And right now, internally, we have some bots that can play the game, mimicking human behaviors. By the way, it's different from like training very capable agents and can win the game every time.
Mm.
Because comparing to mimicking how human players, can play the game, that makes it super valuable in testing how, for example, the new game content appears to the true players, I would
Mm.
say. So that's definitely an example put into use. But if I may, I can probably mention some other early researches. For
Mm.
example, we try to learn some kind of representation, if I may use that word, of players according to the data that we have with them. The intention is trying to understand our player in a much better way in order to, in some sense, optimize the content that we can provide to
Mm.
the game players to maximize their fun that they can have within the game.
Mm. And is this an example of this content? Say, I've read the term kind of procedural content generation, which is essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, where AI creates game environments or levels or different kind of assets dynamically, right?
Right, right.
Is
You're
this an
right.
example?
Yeah. That for sure. Procedural content generation, I think that's a concept that has been around for many years.
Mm.
And nowadays, I would say not only in gaming industry, I think in a lot of different industries that focus on content production, people are looking more and more into this Gen AI or generative AI, not necessarily using the more classic procedural content generation approach.
Mm.
Um, the good thing about Gen AI is that it can learn the distribution from your data. Whatever that data is, you can mimic how it actually distributes by
Mm.
itself and how it's possibly created. So it's mimicking the creation process, not
Mm.
necessarily the objective process that is truly created, but it can create something that looks very much alike the content that you expose to the model.
Mm.
And in King or gaming industry, I certainly see like different trials of, leveraging that. But I think the problem out there is that, like, every people is talking about that. But what is really challenging in this domain is that people need a so-called foundation generative model in order to make it useful.
Mm.
Um, the requirement to getting that kind of model is pretty high because you need super big loads of data to
Mm.
train such an foundation model. The reason why you need a foundation model is because you can imagine it's probably very simple to train a generative model on a small data set. But
Mm.
then what? I mean, if you get such a model and then you want it to generate something that's slightly different, it's
Mm.
incapable of doing that.
Mm.
Imagine in this case. So
Mm.
it needs to see a lot of different data, probably very large. And then
Mm.
after that, you can get a model that is useful, that is generalizable to new use cases. I
Mm.
think that is something researchers in the gaming industry is still trying to solve.
Yeah. And yeah, I think on the topic of kind of Gen AI, it was something I was going to get into a little bit later, but we can stay on this topic for a little bit and talk a little bit about also the retrieval augmented generation. So as far as I understand, this RAG, retrieval augmented generation, is emerging as a critical approach to improving AI performance. Right?
Yeah.
Some argue that RAG will solve many or some of the limitations of these large language models. Could you potentially explain its significance or its kind of potential applications in gaming?
I would say RAG, it's such an important concept nowadays. This concept exists because of large language models available nowadays for use. The importance of RAG, basically RAG means a retrieval augmented generation. It basically solved the problem that LLM or large language models, they don't have sufficient or domain specific knowledge
Right.
to be really useful in a specific domain, let's say
Well,
gaming.
they need to be fed that knowledge, right?
Yeah. So RAG is a process that you fed relevant information for the large language model to be able to answer some kind of questions or doing some tasks in a correct way, in a relevant way. So the whole point of this RAG process lies in how can you provide relevant information to the large language model to answer the question or generating contents that's super relevant. I guess in the gaming industry or enterprises, companies, this process is super important. The reasons are twofold, I would say. On one side, I think this is a general use case for a lot of companies. They have this headache or problem of having many documents or information lying around in a very scattered way. In, for example, Google Drive, or in Slack chat, even in a lot of different places. So people are thinking about how can we retrieve those information, organize it, store it, and then retrieve them according to the questions answered. That is definitely one of the use. The other part, specifically for gaming, is I'm really happy that we discussed the topic about Gen AI, content generation in gaming, and I mentioned the generalization capability. It's very important. You have one choice of collecting loads of data and trying to train a foundation model. This is one approach. I can see it might work, but requires a lot of man-hour, a lot of effort, a lot of cost.
Yep.
The other approach is that people are talking about maybe you can just grab one big pre-trained model, and then you provide this model with relevant context. Okay, so in that case, for example, if you provide it with some kind of game asset or game content, then hopefully it can generate something that is mimicking the content that you gave it. So this is just an imaginary sort of use case that I can imagine right now. I think in sort of applied research, this is still very actively being researched right now. It's not a solve the problem, as a matter of fact.
I was going to ask you next on based on where you see its maturity today, kind of how what's the current state in your mind? How do you expect it to develop in the near future?
That's a question that's always lingering around in my mind recently. Actually, I personally feel very much fascinated about this research. I would say we need probably a very specific and tailored way of digesting, analyzing, and retrieve the information in correspondence to the use case that we are talking about here. Let me give you an example. Nowadays, a lot of people are talking about RAG, but when they're talking about RAG, they're usually referring to this plain RAG, which is just, if you have a document, a PDF file, it's just a matter of, chopping it up, only care about those sort of textual contents, probably throw away a lot of charts, a lot of images, right? Imagine some of the doc, its layout is so complicated, and actually, if you just take those texts out and chunk them into different pieces, into small pieces, and store them in a database and then retrieve them back later, it doesn't usually work so well because you missed a lot of relevant context by throwing away layout information, throwing away multimodal information, throwing away the correlation between different parts in the same documents. And there is another sort of extreme nowadays. People are talking about, oh, maybe we should use graph to represent the content in the document. But the problem with that is that usually people try to leverage large language model and extract those, we call it triplets, from the document. Let's say in a paragraph, I realize, okay, so Lele is actually mentioned in the content. So Lele better be represented as a node in the graph. It's something we call it entity. And then in the same paragraph, it mentioned Lele had breakfast in the morning. So there is another entity being created in the graph saying breakfast, which is another entity in the graph. And then between these two entities, Lele and breakfast, there is a line in between. We call it edge. And this edge tells eat. There's an information attached with it. And you can imagine this level of information extraction or storage, it's very much granularized. And the argument there, why it's better than the plain RAG, is it has this capability of helping the big model or large language model to do reasoning. That's why people go like super fascinated about it. But really, imagine the normal sort of the usual questions people usually ask a large language model or foundation model from those unstructured documents. Usually, it's not very much, stiff or structured, or like relying on those low-level information. Sometimes it actually needs a bit of reasoning using a big scope of information that is retrieved from relevant different parts. So there is a recent trend. People are talking about a mid-level kind of RAG. I'm not sure what's the right term to describe it, actually.
So somewhere in between, is it?
Yeah, something in between. You see, like we cannot do plain RAG, and graph RAG, arguably, in many cases, it's very much low level. So we need something between, which is actually rely on, we call it document layout analysis. So trying to segment the document pages using visual models, like into paragraphs, into like charts, into images, and then they analyze the semantic overlap between those different parts, and then build graph from this analysis. And you can imagine this type of graph stays between the usual graph RAG that we were talking about, and also serves much better purpose comparing to the plain RAG. So this is a new trend, I believe.
And in the context of gaming, how is this applicable? How is it applied?
So in a gaming industry, there might be like many different use cases. If we're going to take a use case, let's say we want to explore new game content, or like particularly in King's in King's perspective, because King is a mobile game developer. So if we're trying to create really good and engaging game levels, then we have to provide with existing game levels designed by game designers. Usually they have pretty good knowledge about what are the good traits about a good game level. So we just feed those information to the large language model in a paradigm that is mimicking RAG. But in this case, we need to think about, similarly to dealing with documents, PDFs, what is the right level of information that we should extract? And what is the right representation way of like this such kind of information? So in our case, for example, each level, because Candy Crush, for example, is the most famous game that's developed by King, and it's a match 3 game. So we can imagine there are a lot of different elements on the game board, right? So representing a level. And of course, there are other elements. So if we manage to simplify this, there are a lot of elements. So I guess a natural way is that perhaps you need to represent those game elements into some kind of entity. And then you need to build some kind of relation between those entities according to, how close they are, or like, is it a legal move? For example, a lot of those considerations you need to represent into into this database, into this graph. I'm not saying graph is the best way forward, but if you want to represent this game level as a graph, it's totally possible. And you need to design it, and you need to reason about, the pros and cons of representing your game level in one way or another. I guess to find the right way of doing, this kind of a RAG, it requires a lot of trial and error, I would say. And this is something I know that in King, and especially the teams around me or in our team, we care very much about this stream of research right now.
Super. And what about some of the biggest AI challenges in gaming? How are you guys tackling these? Mention maybe a few examples.
The biggest challenge in applying AI technology in gaming is trying to find the right scenario, I would say, because our conversation has touched upon many points. Actually, there are scenarios where you can train agents to play the game. And there are scenarios that you can leverage perhaps RAG kind of approach or graph representation to deal with content generation. And there are also places that you can apply AI or machine learning in optimizing some game feature.
These kind of non-player characteristics.
Yeah, there are a lot of different domains that you can apply to it. But then you need to reason about, well, I guess it's a common problem in many companies. You have limited bandwidth, right? So how can you make sure that you're working on the most valuable problem? And sometimes you need to balance a bit of, people call it low-hanging fruit versus a long-term risky solution. And you don't know whether you're going to succeed or not in the future. It takes time. So it's very hard to balance there, actually.
And how do you typically kind of reason there? You mentioned kind of low hanging fruit? You mentioned that kind of long term strategic risk. How do you balance that?
It's hard. It's hard, and it's dynamic. But I guess. By the way, I can probably provide a bit more sort of context about my work and team, because that's related. That's relevant in this conversation. I work in a team called AI Labs. That is more focusing on applied research. So you can say the use cases or the research topics that we work on has long-term impact on business value. We're not anxiously chase after low-hanging fruit or a goal that is right, in front of us. And we have other sort of sibling team, which is working on more, I would say, use case based. We have a clear defined use case, and we probably know some ways of tackling that. And we want to deploy some kind of model for testing in 3 or 6 months, relatively speaking. So, we have different teams with different focuses. But in my team, I think we also care about so-called low-hanging fruit or some kind of immediate value from applied research. So we have this, we are actually working on something that is helping us to prioritize our work. We try to develop some kind of frameworks, like, for example, we have a dimension whether we want to focus on, the near-term effect or long-term effect or value. And we have another dimension because we are applied research team. We can take a bit more risk. We want to work a bit more on the state-of-the-art methods, trying to dig a bit deeper into the problem those methods has, especially when we're trying to apply those methods directly onto our data set, onto our problem. Then in those cases, we probably need more time. And the approach is more risky because in the future, in the end of the tunnel, we don't know whether it's going to be truly successful or not. But anyways, I think the learning is very important in the end, and communicating this kind of learning throughout the organization and also sharing with the research community. I think this is also making us happy.
Yeah, I can imagine like that kind of sharing this kind of
Sharing is
knowledge
caring.
public.
We
Yeah,
say it.
exactly.
We say
Sharing is
it.
caring.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But on to hiring in these kind of AI and machine learning roles. I'm interested to get your point of view here as well. What are some of the biggest challenges, do you think, in hiring developers for these AI and machine learning roles today? You can say in the context of your team or more generally, it's up to you.
Um, yeah, I've been sort of, in and out in recruiting process, not only in King but also in my previous occupations. I had a lot of observations and also had a lot of learning myself too. And this is also a very competitive and dynamic sort of job market, I would say.
Increasingly so, yeah.
Yeah. Very, very hot. I guess, at least from my personal perspective, I think, especially if you want to become a machine learning or AI developer, engineer, or researcher in industry, I think one of the quality, curiosity, is very
Mm.
important to me.
Mm.
You need to feel that you are pumped to do this instead of being pushed to do this. This make a fundamental difference.
Yeah.
And especially if you are working this domain, a lot of the problems, a lot of the approaches, they are entirely new, and they're super dynamic, developing super fast. If you don't have that pulse inside of you and chasing after the each sort of bits and bytes in that domain, it's very hard to follow up and trying to apply them into your work. I think since you asked, I think curiosity is something that I personally feel very important.
Yeah, no, really, really well put. But a lot of companies struggle to really like effectively evaluate these kind of candidates, right? Those working with
Right.
AI and machine learning. Are there any best practices that you'd recommend for hiring managers? You can pay attention to these softer aspects, right, like curiosity, but how does one kind of effectively evaluate these candidates, basically?
Oh wow, it's such a question that I didn't prepare that well.
Mhm.
I think, but I can sort of elaborate a bit of my thinking.
Mhm.
I'm mature, I would say, but this represents something that I have tried and succeeded in the future. I generally feel a bit neutral in doing sort of whiteboard programming,
Mm.
especially nowadays. This just represents my personal view.
Mm.
Because of the large language model and coding assistant that is becoming much better nowadays.
Mm.
I personally use that too myself. I think you know so I have several aspects. First, I think it's very important to ask the candidates reflect on real project, especially the project that's deployed and making value in the past.
Mm.
I want them to reflect on those projects and reason about what has been going well, what has been sort of not going so well, and why is that? What's the improvement that can be made there?
Mm.
This is one thing that I find super valuable to understand their experiences and mindset.
Mm.
The second part, um, although we don't I think in the past I haven't really asked any candidates to do sort of real-time whiteboarding, sort of
Mm.
coding
Mm.
tasks. Instead, we give them some kind of data set and a problem,
Yeah.
asking them to do analytics um, and do a bit of modeling work on the side.
Mhm.
It's time boxed. It's like half a day or
Mhm.
one day, 24 hours, and then they return with their solution.
Mm.
And then we, of course, review the solution with the experts. And then we decide whether we want to have them on site and discuss the
Mm.
solution, like walk through the solution,
Mm.
having them present the solution step by step, answering questions and concerns from our side. I
Mm.
think this interactive process can raise a lot of issues, a lot of insights
Mm.
for the recruiter, and also probably very useful for the candidates. I
Mm.
cannot say for them, but I feel that's probably beneficial. This is the second part. And the last part I find I liked pretty much, very much like that approach, is that during the interview, I usually ask them to answer some, I would say, key questions around machine learning. Not very deep, not very sort of sophisticated, but the common terms, the common concepts, the common practices people, practitioners in this domain should just know by heart.
Yep. Yep.
So I just tell them, okay, for the next 10 minutes, I have a bunch of questions. If you know, you just give me a short answer. If you don't know, just say pass. Like this is just like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I find it's very, very helpful to learn about whether they're actually learn the important concepts by heart. Because in machine learning practical jobs or works, it's so easy to do wrong in many places if you just ignore those important rules. And those are the three aspects that I want to mention. I might miss some kind of important aspects that I did in the past, but this is something that I just surface into the top of my mind when you ask such a question. Yeah.
No, I think it's really, really well put. Again, some things you should just know, but I like the fact that you mention, trying to mimic that, the real world scenarios or examples and talking through problems, because that's kind of what you're doing on a daily basis, right? So I think it makes complete sense. But what about some common misconceptions about working in AI and machine learning research, or what are the most common misconceptions in your view?
That's great that you asked this question. I would say, especially as a new graduate from the major of machine learning, deep learning, whatever, generally computer science, you're going to wish that you're going to work on a project that's so important. By the way, all of the projects, they are important because they are like kicked off. There is a reason for that. Yep. But the common misconception there is that they think they're going to work on building the model itself. Mm-hmm. It's so false. As a matter of fact. So let's say if all of your work is 100%, okay, I would say, if I may say it, like 10% of your time is working on like building the actual model, training the actual model. That's good enough. And so many people just understand it in such a wrong way that they think, okay, so when this project is kicked off, I should have the best data set I can train my model on. I know clearly from day one which model I should train. Is it a classifier? Is it a, I don't know, variational autoencoder? Is it a BERT? Whatever. But actually, most of the cases, it's not true. You have nothing to start with. You just have a mandate. You just have a problem in front of you. And sometimes this problem is so vague. As vague as, okay, we want to improve the user experience. How about that? In that case, good luck. I mean, that's why we need experiences in the industry. Yeah. How to break down the problem that is vague, fluffy, into concrete steps, well-defined, well-scoped problems that you can work on. And then after that, you start with, I don't know, maybe talking to people and knowing where you can possibly get such a data. And by the way, most likely that you're going to face with a data warehouse that is so messy, and you need to dig, you need to create a lot of query, you need to create the data set yourself. Yep. And that's not just one day thing, that's an iteration process. Yep. And then you start to, read a bit of paper, read a bit of whatever. And then you decide, okay, I want to try this method. I want to try that model. And then after you train some model, and you find, the performance is not so great. So what is the problem? Is it because of model? Is it because of data? Actually, I missed an information in my data set. So I go back, day 0. That's the norm of, I would say, machine learning engineers or machine learning researchers' daily life. Yeah. That is sometimes frustrating, I would say. If you don't have curiosity, if you don't have this motivation, it can be very frustrating and demotivating sometimes. So I guess be prepared there would be super important.
Yep. Really, really interesting to hear. What would you say? You've mentioned curiosity. Would you say that that's the one thing that aspiring AI machine learning engineers should have in order to stand out in such a competitive job market? I mean, I was reading the other day how this kind of demand for this kind of talent is growing so significantly year over year, but that like only a fifth of professionals have the necessary like deep learning expertise required for these modern AI jobs. So would you say it is curiosity, or would you say there's anything additional that these kind of engineers need to do to stand out?
Curiosity is definitely very important to start with, but curiosity is not everything. Curiosity probably can get you started, either in the correct direction or in the wrong direction, because you're curious. Okay,
Yep.
I remember one sentence told by my supervisor in the past, my PhD supervisor in the past. If you realize there is a very interesting domain and no one has been heavily working in that domain, and you wonder why that is the case, and that domain is really intriguing, there are two possibilities. One, it's hopeless.
Good to
Two,
start there. Yeah.
yeah. Two, you're damn
Yeah.
lucky.
Yeah.
So, which one would you think you're in? Most likely the first one.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that leads actually to my second point. I think on top of curiosity, you need persistence. You need to believe in what you're doing and not giving up easily. Give yourself a bit longer time. Give yourself, you know, basically persuading yourself into, spending more time in this direction, as long as there is no clear evidence it will not work.
Mm.
I think, imagine the early sort of demos, use cases from, I mentioned this handwriting sort of recognition task, MNIST, this data set. I think this data set has been, researched for a very long time since its creation. The accuracy is, growing up until, deep neural nets gets to run on GPUs, and suddenly it changed everything. And it takes many, many years until that happened, So I think the truly successful researchers in this domain, they have both curiosity and persistency.
Yep.
Like these two, they're helping each other, basically.
Good. And how do you see the role of AI evolving in software development generally over the next 5 years? In your opinion, for example, do you see it fully replacing developers, or or will it act more as this kind of augmented assistant to the developer, like it is now, essentially?
Yeah, it's just fascinating with the current sort of tide of advancement in this domain. And I see more and more people around me, and also not around me, they're reporting that they are getting a very good sort of experience with using sort of coding assistant. And I tried myself. And to be honest, from maybe, I don't know, 2022-ish, I starting to realize I code from scratch less and less because of this tide of change.
Yeah.
And not even mentioning nowadays on the market, there are a lot of startups. There are a lot of products, commercial or free, that you can try it out. Like recently, I think there is this startup called Lovable, getting so much attention nowadays, and also kids. They're also sort of getting involved in those tools and creating some like very interesting applications themselves by talking to large language models and agents. So RAG is definitely helping with that, because as I already mentioned, no matter how much code the foundation programming model has seen, there is always some kind of new domain, new patterns of programming, or new programming language it hasn't seen. So this RAG thing is still valid.
Yeah.
It needs
and also
to know
kind of up-to-date information or up-to-date data.
Exactly, right? Yes. And here we touch upon another question that we mentioned multiple times before in this conversation. What is the right way of representing this particular type of content? For PDF, For documents, there is one way. For game levels or game content, there is another way. For code, what is the best way? Someone might argue, yeah, it's just a natural language, right? Really? Well, probably most of the time. But like programming languages, they have their own traits. Probably you need to tweak a bit how you represent them and present them into large language model. So about the future trend, I think it's going to be great. I think the people or the developer who can leverage those services, those tools, they're going to excel. They're going to do so well. That said, I think probably the most important skill in the future is to reason about the problem on your hand, trying to define them well, trying to break down those questions or problems into controllable blocks or steps, and then ask the tools around you to finish the tasks. I think this is a very important skill in the future.
Yep.
And of course, we still need a bunch of applied researchers, fundamental researchers to develop this technology into the future.
Yeah, exactly. But these kind of the introduction of these AI assistants or these AI assisted coding tools, these introduce kind of these security concerns, ethical considerations, and everything. So, what do you think in terms of AI and machine learning research, and for these researchers, what are the most pressing ethical considerations that you guys are prioritizing?
Ooh, actually, it's very hard for me to just name one prioritization. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of different aspects concerning, kicking off a machine learning project. Especially, I mean, that concern is multifaceted. It can rely on the data that you collect. It can rely on the model that you try to apply. It can be about the prediction that you are making there. But generally speaking, I think we need, especially from the enterprise level, like in our company, we have a very big effort of ethical AI review board. We have a bunch of experts gathered together. They have a schedule, they have a calendar on which they have a list of AI projects that's carried out in the organization, and they review them as a collective effort with the project team together to identify potential problems out there. If I may just raise one point in those projects, the common sort of machine learning projects, I think inclusiveness and unbiasedness, it's probably one of the most common mentioned issue nowadays.
Yep.
Yeah. I think it's very challenging to do it well because no matter how hard you try, the data that you collect, it's always biased, I would say. Most of the cases.
Yeah, I was going to mention, I mean, this is still a significant, a really major issue, right? AI bias. Because you're only feeding these models with data that is by nature biased to a degree, right? So it's like, how do you mitigate that?
Exactly, right? So before you actually train any model, I think it's very important to understand your data. That is very important. And then the understanding work should result in awareness of your bias. Only when you're aware of those biases, and then as a data scientist, as a machine learning engineer, then you can think about possible procedure, possible methods to mitigate them. If you're not aware of them, then there's no sort of talking about how to solve that at all, right? So that is definitely one of the concerns that I've been hearing people talking about a lot. And I appreciate that you mentioned, this, for example, programming tool is helping people a lot more nowadays about the security, for example, of programmers, developers. But I think this whole development also allows a lot of people to go into this job market, go into this sort of work, because the entry barrier nowadays is much lower than before.
Much lower, yeah, absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So it's always a balance thing. It's always like a thing that has multiple facets and multiple aspects.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like you mentioned, the tool Lovable, these are kind of making or giving access to, it's like democratizing kind of code in a way where you give access to so many more people. But I think
Exactly.
you touched upon it a little bit as well when you were talking about how coders today, the more senior coders, are going to be focusing on other aspects such as infrastructure and system design and stuff like that, right? It's more, yeah, you might be able
Exactly.
to spin up an app quite quickly, but you need to actually reason with the tool and tell it how, or make sure that it's doing it in the best way possible, right? So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
but what's your take on, like, generally speaking, like, do you sit on the side of like, oh, we need stronger AI regulation, or should companies self-regulate, for example? Because there's a balance here between AI innovation and kind of ethical responsibility, right? So where do you sit on this debate, if we put it that way?
As a researcher,
Mm,
I'm always for the like supporting the emphasizing on the importance of ethical issues in research in AI engineering part. I think this is super important. I've seen like personally, videos and demos that has severe ethical issue,
mm,
like
mm,
using vision model to control a weapon,
mm,
and you just like you got intimidated about how well that performs, and that kind of thing needs
mm,
serious consideration, needs
mm,
serious sort of regulation out there. Um, and I guess generally speaking, we should also support innovativeness, innovation in AI in AI research. But we should be always aware of the possible consequences.
mm,
And I'm for the idea of having some high level guidance or framework about AI research or development, some regulation there. Yes, that's
mm,
very important. That's very sort of critical in the end. Um, but then we also see how to make different, I don't know, economy bodies or countries to align 100% on
mm.
this issue. It's very challenging,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
see this is a continuous effort um, that we have to bring together all of the nations, all of the countries, and I would say especially China and US
Yeah,
onto the
exactly.
same boat.
You kind of, it's possible. It's just an arms race at the moment, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
continues to be. Yeah.
Mm, mm.
Yeah. But are there any? I think, yeah, like, really moving on to the last section here is in terms of like your advice and for engineers, but also looking ahead. Are there any trends in AI and machine learning that particularly excite you, or that you think people should be paying more attention to?
Certainly. To start with, the recent success of large language model um, doesn't mean the current learning infrastructure or the model architecture is the best. Um, I think, well, a lot of people is using services from OpenAI, for example, and Google has their own, and Microsoft has their own sort of large language model, and etc. But every query, every question that you ask, gonna consume quite a bit of energy,
Mm, mm,
and often those models are quite big and expensive to run and scale.
mhm,
So I think in the future there should be a trend of studying how to get the model much smaller and more efficient, and that perhaps going to touch upon the foundation transformer way of working,
mm,
because all of the recent advances coming from this paper, attention is all you need. Then the question is, really? There are also recent researchers like focusing on some different architectures, some different ways of working inside the model. So far, no one is truly as successful as attention model or transformer. But I believe in the future there might be better way of training such model, of hosting such model. Um, of course, nowadays a lot of people is talking about GPU is actually the enabler. But do we really? Well, is GPU really the best fit? I mean, there are TPUs. Well, are they really similar to GPU? Arguably, they're doing the same like thing and achieving the same target. But maybe there are better way. I mean, scientists, they are working on even quantum computing.
Yep.
I'm like generally happy that I live in such an era with a lot of science advancement. So I guess as a practitioner in this domain, in machine learning, in AI, we should definitely follow the advancement in small language model rather than large language model. I think this large, the first L in LLM, is going to be like more like a negative word in the future. In the future, probably people are like all proud of, oh, we are hosting SLM, small language model.
Where these, in essence, then, when you think that these kind of models would be not so kind of general purpose, just much more kind of custom in that
Definitely.
aspect, yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. In many cases, you just need some kind of domain-specific experts to help you to do very specific tasks. Then, like, it's very hard to argue why you should need a fully fledged, fully trained large language model, right? And actually, I've seen recently a lot of the new ideas being popped out, growing everywhere, resulting in startups in resolving vertical sectors problems using relatively smaller model. I think these are really good trends.
Nice. And last question from me: what's next for you in your research at the ABK?
It changes quite often because I'm curious. But generally speaking, if we're talking about work-wise, work-related research, I think I'm going to be continue working on reinforcement learning to train, agents that can play the game for testing purposes. And also, we're looking into representation learning of gaming experiences. As I told you, it's for the sake of understanding our players so that we can tailor or optimize the content that we can provide to them. And the third thing, I think it's about how to integrate Gen AI into the gaming industry. Because in like gaming industry or game itself, it's a multimodal kind of content. It has music, it has game assets, graphics, it has game levels, it has texts even, right? So by the way, I want to mention one work that is done by Microsoft Research recently. It's called WAM. It's accepted and published in Nature. The essence of that work is that they trained a foundation model on a bunch of video gaming gaming videos, actually video clips, not the game itself. It's video clips.
Just with clips of people playing the
clips
game, basically.
with textual prompts. So the result of that work is that they have a visual game engine that can accept your prompt, which is textual, and then generate some gaming video that can reflect your prompt. Right. You can actually edit what appears in the game, which is super interesting, fascinating. I really recommend someone interested to check it out.
Yeah, it sounds super interesting. So like, I'm a gamer who would like typically, have a remote control and I'll be playing the game. Do you think the people are going to be kind of talking their way through these games and they're going to be prompting in order to play games?
Yeah. I personally believe this is going to become true one day. Yeah, sure.
So cool.
Yeah.
Nice. Really nice. Well, yeah, I think we can leave it there. But do you have anything else to say? Any advice for those listening wanting to get into the field?
I would really encouraging people to get into this field, and at the same time, I want to reflect on one question that we discussed, which is the expectation of entering this field. There are a lot of misconceptions, and especially the frustration that I personally has been experiencing in my own job. I want to put a warning there. Be careful. It's not always smooth. It's not like what you're told in the textbook. This is real life. It can fail a lot of the time, but success is in the end of the tunnel. be curious, be persistent, and value is guaranteed, either the successful value or the learning value.
Yeah. No, really, really well put. And I think succeeding, 1 out of 100 times, if that, it still makes it worth it, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
Nice. Well, Lele, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really, really insightful conversation. So thank you.
Thanks for the conversation. I find your questions, they are very curiosity driven.
That word
Great
again,
discussion.
right? I'm a curious person too.
Yeah.
No, thank you once again. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, share it with your network. Until next time, keep building, keep innovating, and we'll see you soon.